Dawn came gray and soundless over Newgate. The fog hung low enough to taste, sour with coal smoke and damp iron. You could hear it before you could see it. The murmuring tide of bodies pressing toward the gallows yard. Thousands of boots scraping the cobbles, thousands of throats whispering the same uneasy word: hanging. It was May 26, 1868, the day Britain finally looked itself in the mirror and saw a nation entertained by death. The condemned man's name was Michael Barrett, an Irish Fenian, convicted of an explosion in Clerkenwell that killed 12 innocent bystanders. But the trial was complicated, the evidence disputed, and justice, like the air that morning, was heavy, hard to breathe. Crowds came anyway, men in top hats, women clutching children, pickpockets weaving between them. Vendors sold penny broadsheets recounting crimes before the man was even dead. For many, this was not punishment, it was theater, the last great show London would ever stage in blood. Inside the prison, Barrett prayed in a whisper. Chaplains knelt beside him, but even prayer seemed embarrassed, out of place among the clicking of the clock. The hangman, William Calcraft, prepared his ropes with the precision of habit. He had hanged more than 400 people in his career, yet this morning his hands trembled. The wind outside carried a strange hush, the collective breath of 20,000 waiting souls. When the gates opened, the crowd surged like a wave. The scaffold loomed, black against the dawn. Barrett's face was pale, his eyes searching the sea of strangers who had paid with sleep to watch him die. Some crossed themselves, others laughed. Calcraft placed the hood, adjusted the knot, and at 8 a.m., the lever fell. A gasp rose, then a terrible stillness. The body twitched once, twice, then hung motionless. Someone in the crowd began to clap before realizing what they had done. The sound died instantly. Within an hour, the square emptied. Vendors swept coins and crusts from the stones. Rain began to fall, soft, deliberate, cleansing nothing. And from that morning onward, no one in Britain would ever again die before a cheering crowd. The last public hanging had done its work. It showed the nation its own reflection and found the face unbearable. You can still see the outline of the gallows in the old sketches. Wooden beams against stone walls, ropes coiled like punctuation waiting for a sentence. To the Victorians, execution was a kind of grammar, a final full stop at the end of a story society no longer wished to read. In 1868, the machinery of justice was polished, rehearsed, and deeply admired. The Home Office issued printed guidelines on rope length, trapdoor weight, the distance a body should fall. Science and punishment marched hand in hand. Yet behind the mathematics, the same ancient spectacle remained. Flesh meeting gravity, the crowd learning what it already knew. The newspapers called hanging a necessary warning to the wicked. Pamphlets described it as moral instruction. But everyone understood its true purpose. It was theater disguised as virtue, a ritual that let ordinary people taste righteousness by watching someone else fall. In London, no tickets were needed, only curiosity and the nerve to stand close enough to hear the neck break. On the morning of Barrett's execution, police lines held back the surge of spectators. Vendors sold meat pies, gin bottles passed hand to hand. There were songs, too, mocking ballads about the Fenian plot. It felt less like judgment and more like carnival. A woman in a bonnet lifted her child onto her shoulders so the boy could see history. The boy asked later why everyone had cheered. No one answered. Inside Newgate, the rituals of bureaucracy clanked into motion. The warden read the warrant, the chaplain offered prayer, the executioner tested the bolt. Each act was measured to the minute, as if precision could make cruelty respectable. Barrett's final words were recorded by the press: "God save Ireland." They were erased from most papers the next day. When the body was cut down, the coroner certified death. The rope was logged as state property, and the gallows dismantled for storage. Forms were signed, ink dried. Justice was satisfied, order restored, and everyone went home slightly dirtier inside. But the machinery had begun to rust. For the first time, editorials questioned not guilt, but spectacle. "If we punish murder by inviting thousands to watch it," one wrote, "do we cure the disease or spread it?" The question lingered like smoke in the damp morning air. By nightfall, Even those who defended the law admitted something had shifted. The scaffold had done its duty too well. It had shown how much the living still loved to kill. No one could recall who first shouted that an execution was happening, but by dawn, the news had traveled faster than the Thames tide. From Clerkenwell to Camden, from the stews of Shoreditch to the polished squares of Bloomsbury, people spilled into the streets. London was a city of a million hungers. Hunger for food, for spectacle, for meaning, and on hanging days, all three were fed. They came in every shape the century could offer. Factory girls with shawls drawn tight, laborers reeking of gin, lawyers in black coats, sailors just returned from foreign ports. Some carried lanterns, others apples for breakfast. The poorest climbed lampposts, pressing their faces against the iron to get a clearer view. The wealthiest rented balconies overlooking the prison wall. No sermon, no election, no coronation drew such a congregation. Hanging was, after all, the people's theater, free, immediate, moral in name if not in spirit. They believed that seeing a man die might keep them honest for a week or two. Mothers told their sons, "Remember this, and you'll stay straight." The sons nodded and cheered when the trap opened. For the authorities, crowds were both necessity and menace. Too few spectators and the example failed. Too many, and the example might turn on them. Police lined the streets 3 rows deep, truncheons ready. Some officers admitted later that they too watched with fascination. Discipline faltered when death became entertainment. As the morning light grew, the murmur changed pitch, anticipation sharpening into appetite. Ballad sellers shouted verses written overnight, promising the full confession of the condemned. They sold out before the rope was tested. A man in the crowd bet half a crown on how long it would take Barrett to die. Another swore the hangman always looked drunk. Beneath their banter ran an undercurrent of dread. If justice could err once, it might err again, and any one of them might one day stand where Barrett stood. At 8 o'clock, when the black door swung open and the procession appeared, a collective shiver rippled outward. Every head turned, every voice fell silent. It was not mercy that stilled them. It was the intimacy of watching another's final breath. The moment was obscene and holy all at once. When it was over, the crowd dispersed as if waking from trance. Some vomited in the gutters. Others argued over whether the drop had been clean. Broadsheets printed within the hour declared justice triumphant. But that night, in taverns across the city, men drank quietly, avoiding each other's eyes. Crowds are easy to gather and impossible to forget. London had seen riots, coronations, parades, but nothing so revealing as the thousands who stood that day to learn what conscience looked like when it lost its voice. Michael Barrett was 27 when they built the scaffold that would carry his name into history. He was born in Dublin, a bricklayer's son who learned early that work built other men's empires. By the 1860s, Ireland simmered under British rule, and Barrett joined the Fenian Brotherhood, a movement for independence whispered in taverns and printed in secret on hand presses that smelled of ink and defiance. The Clerkenwell explosion was meant to free fellow Fenians from prison. The blast tore through the street instead, killing 12 bystanders, 5 of them women. In the days that followed, London's papers demanded vengeance. Barrett's name appeared before his guilt was proven. Witnesses contradicted each other, and the evidence wavered like candlelight. But someone had to hang to prove the empire still ruled its own conscience. Inside Newgate, Barrett waded through 3 trials. Reporters described him as calm, polite, almost scholarly, with eyes that met their questions without flinching. "I do not seek pity," he said, "only truth." But truth had no audience large enough to fill the yard. The verdict was sealed. William Calcraft, the hangman, prepared his tools as he had done hundreds of times before. He was 68, stooped, and nearly blind, yet still the government's man for the job. His rope was a blend of hemp and superstition, greased to slide cleanly, measured to break, but not sever the neck. Calcraft prided himself on efficiency, though the crowds knew his work often failed. Many of his victims strangled slowly, dancing on air while London watched. The night before the execution, Calcraft slept in a cell near the gallows. He claimed later that Barrett sang through the dark hours, a soft Gaelic hymn rising through the stone walls. In the morning, as they walked together to the scaffold, Calcraft muttered, "Forgive me, lad." Barrett answered, "It is not you I need to forgive." When the rope was placed around his neck, Barrett looked out at the sea of faces. Some were jeering, some praying, most merely staring. "God save Ireland," he said again, his last rebellion in 6 syllables. Then the floor fell away. The drop was short. Calcraft's measurements were wrong. Barrett struggled for several long seconds, body twisting, boots scraping wood. The crowd gasped, some turning away. The hangman tugged at the legs to hasten the end. When it was over, even the most hardened onlooker stayed silent. Calcraft cut the rope, folded it neatly, and walked away without meeting anyone's eye. He retired soon after, never speaking of that morning again. The last man to die in public, and the last man to kill in daylight for the crown, had met on that scaffold, and neither left whole. When the lever dropped at 8 o'clock that morning, it was more than a man who fell, it was a tradition. The thud that followed marked the end of a century's appetite for death as spectacle. Yet few in the crowd understood that as they watched. They had come to witness justice. They left carrying a kind of shame that clung to them like soot. Rain began before the body was cut down, thin as mist, but relentless. People scattered toward coffee stalls and gin shops, their shoes black with mud. Some joked to disguise the unease. Others stood motionless, eyes fixed on the empty rope swaying in the wind. A newspaper seller whispered, "That's the last you'll see of it." He was right. The government had already decided. Inside Parliament, reports of unseemly behavior among spectators reached the Home Secretary within hours. The Times printed a careful editorial. "The lesson is now learned. The time has come to withdraw this grim pageant from the public street." In drawing rooms, the upper classes murmured agreement. In taverns, the poor were less certain. Public hangings were, in their own dark way, democracy's theater, the one event where the high and low met without invitation. But even the street needed rest. London was tired of playing executioner. Decades of reform had softened the language of punishment. Prisons were now called institutions, and whipping posts removed from public squares. Civilization, it seemed, required privacy for its cruelties. The scaffold was dismantled before noon. Workmen disassembled the beams as rain streaked the black paint. By evening, only stains remained on the cobbles. The rope was logged as state property, Barrett's body buried within the prison walls, unmarked. Crowds drifted home through alleys that smelled of beer and wet stone. By dusk, London looked ordinary again, except for the silence. Those who had cheered felt a hollow ache they couldn't name. Housewives wiping windows paused to watch the sky. Apprentices lingered near lampposts, staring at their own reflections in puddles. It was as if the city, all at once, realized the intimacy of what it had witnessed. The next day, the newspapers sold briskly, printing Barrett's final words in bold. But none printed the sound that had followed. The gasp, the cough, the long stillness that hung over the yard like a question. In the weeks that followed, Parliament passed the Capital Punishment Amendment Act, moving executions behind prison walls. There would still be ropes, still be drops, still be men like Calcraft, but no more audiences. London's last open-air sermon of death was finished, and though few said it aloud, many felt relief. They had looked too long into that pit and seen themselves staring back. A nation that had watched a man die for morality had finally begun to understand what morality looked like when no one was watching. After Barrett's execution, Britain drew its curtains. Justice, once performed in the open air, retreated behind stone and silence. The scaffold did not vanish. It merely changed address, moving from the street to the prison yard where witnesses were counted on one hand and all of them wore authority's face. At Newgate, the gallows stood longer than the memory of those who built it. Its timbers absorbed the smell of hemp and sweat, of prayers that ended in choking. The warders called it the stage. The audience now was a handful of officials, a priest, a doctor, and the hangman. No cheers, no vendors, no songs. Only the creak of the rope and the sound of boots turning away. Executions became bureaucratic, another line in a ledger. At 8 o'clock, the prisoner died. By 8:30, a form was signed. By 9, breakfast was served in the officers' mess. The machinery of death ran smoother without the crowd's hunger, but something human was lost in the efficiency. Public shame had once shared the burden of justice. Now the burden fell entirely on those paid to perform it. In 1870, the first journalists petitioned for access, claiming the people had a right to witness what was done in their name. They were refused. The government insisted that secrecy was civility. "We are a moral nation," said one Home Office clerk, "and morality does not advertise its necessities." Yet rumors leaked through the cracks. Hangmen wrote memoirs under pseudonyms, describing how prisoners trembled, how the ropes sometimes snapped, how silence filled the corridors afterward. Some readers devoured the confessions, others burned them. The public had lost the sight but not the appetite. Newspapers printed woodcut illustrations based on imagination, and readers stared at the faces of the condemned as if art could restore the thrill the law had taken away. Behind the prison walls, death became almost polite. Wards were whitewashed, the scaffold hidden beneath canvas until the hour arrived. The condemned received breakfast, brandy, and a prayer. The chaplain read from the Book of Common Prayer. In the midst of life we are in death. Outside, London trams rattled by, passengers unaware that a heartbeat had just stopped behind the brick. Hangmen became technicians, precise, detached, invisible. When one executioner miscalculated the drop and decapitated his prisoner, the authorities ordered new tables of measurement. There was outrage, but not empathy. It was the scandal of error, not the scandal of cruelty, that bothered the age. By the century's end, Britain congratulated itself on its progress. The noose was now discreet, efficient, and hidden. Civilization had tidied up its conscience, storing it safely behind walls too high for remorse to climb. If you walk past the Old Bailey today, where Newgate Prison once stood, you can still feel it, the faint vibration beneath the pavement as if the city remembers what was buried there. The stone facade gleams, and lawyers hurry past in robes and wigs, symbols of an order that prides itself on progress. Yet beneath those steps once hung the wooden beams of the scaffold, and beneath them, the silence of thousands who came to stare. There is no plaque for Michael Barrett. His name exists in ledgers, in yellowed broadsheets, in the echo of a date that ended a tradition. But the air still hums with the residue of that morning. Rain tapping the cobbles, breath condensing on iron railings, the soft murmur of a crowd watching conscience die. After public executions ended, Britain did not stop killing. It merely forgot how to look at itself while doing so. Hangings continued in quiet rooms across the empire, neat and invisible. The rope became cleaner, the reports shorter, the witnesses fewer. Death turned professional, and in that professionalism lay a colder cruelty. Historians call it reform. Poets call it denial. The scaffold moved out of sight but never out of memory. Every empire that survives long enough learns the same lesson. Justice demands witnesses, but comfort demands walls. The last execution in Britain took place in 1964. 2 men, 2 nooses, 2 minutes of state-sanctioned absence. After that, the ropes were burned, the traps dismantled, and the profession of hangman quietly abolished. No one protested, no one cheered. The end came not with outrage but with exhaustion. The nation had simply grown tired of pretending that civility could strangle without leaving marks. Still, the shadow of the scaffold stretches through time. It lies in the fascination with true crime, the hunger for punishment disguised as moral clarity, the uneasy pleasure of seeing others condemned. The same impulse that drew London's crowd in 1868 hums faintly in our own blood. We have traded the square for a screen, the gallows for a headline, but the gaze remains. Stand now on that ground where Barrett once fell. Listen. Beneath the engines and footsteps, you might hear a low echo, the memory of 20,000 breaths held at once, a nation learning what it feels like to be ashamed of itself. If this story has followed you into the dark tonight, let it stay. Remember the faces that watched and the one that fell, because the scaffold was never just wood and rope, it was a mirror, and every time we forget what it showed us, we rebuild it again.